So now we're going to prep the hair canvas to install into our wool shell of our jacket. Just like on the wool jacket, we want to mark all those important points before we remove the hair canvas from our interfacing patterns. So make sure you mark, again, what would be point E where the collar and lapels separate. If you have a corner, make sure you mark if you have where your dart tips are, okay? And you can use a pencil for this on your hair canvas. It's not going to show through anything. All right, so make sure all those points are marked before removing your interfacing pattern from the actual canvas. Don't forget the notch. Things like your don't forget to notch all your notches and your roll line and everything like that. Now, another thing we need to do is, because I have a dart here, I'm going to actually just draw on my seam allowance, okay? And even if you don't have a dart, well, if you don't have a dart, you don't need to sew or draw on your seam allowance. But I am going to draw on my seam allowance where I have a dart because I'm going to want to stay stitch this. Okay, once you've finished marking the seam allowance of your dart, go ahead and stitch right on your seam allowance. Okay, so if you have a dart, you're going to stay stitch, or if you have two separate panels, you'll still stay stitch exactly on your seam allowance. All right, remember I marked my dart so I knew exactly where my point was and where all my stitching lines were. Okay, so here you can see me stay stitching the seam allowance of the dart, okay? I don't need to stay stitch the whole thing because notice there's no pattern to line up after a certain point, okay? Because of the shape of my canvas, of my interfacing here, I only need to mark up or stay stitch the parts that will be stitched together, okay? So if you have a princess seam, you'll stay stitch the whole seam. So now I'm trimming right up to my dart point, okay? Once you've trimmed right up to your dart point, trim to your stay stitching, not through it. And then what's going to happen is we're going to overlap our stay stitching lines. So the reason we did the stay stitching was to mark our stitching lines on the canvas. And we want to be able to overlap those stay stitching lines perfectly because we don't want any bulk in this. So we're overlapping our seams, okay? Same thing if you're doing a princess seam, you just stay stitch on your stitching line. So if you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, stay stitch right at 1/2 inch, and you're just going to overlap it, okay? And notice now I'm lining up my stay stitching, basically like 1/2 inch to 3/4 by 1/2 inch. I'm slowly walking out, make sure my stay stitching is right on top of the stay stitching, and then I'm putting a pin through it, okay? So this is making sure that it's perfectly lined up, stay stitching on top of stay stitching, okay? We have to be very careful doing this in our stitching because we don't want the canvas to be smaller or larger than the wool shell of the garment, okay? Because what we're going to do eventually is we're going to put this canvas into our wool jacket. So slowly continue just to line up your stay stitching. See it on both sides, all lined up, all right? And now once you have it all lined up, what we're going to do is we're going to baste it. So we're just going to do a running basting stitch, uneven basting stitch, okay? Don't put a knot at the end of your thread. And I'm going to baste this right on the stay stitching line, okay? So the reason we're doing this is so that we can take the pins out before we sew it, and it just makes sure everything's lined up. Because when I baste through my stay stitching line, I can see on the front and the back if my stay stitching is lined up, because the basting will go right through it. Okay, so just go ahead and baste through your stay stitching, and make sure you don't pull too tight on your thread because you don't want to shrink or gather up your seam. We're just basting it to hold it together so we can take out the seams and make sure everything is lined up. Okay, once you finish basting, you can see the basting thread goes through right through your stay stitching line. And if it's going through it both on the front and back, then you know you're lined up. Okay, and now let's stitch it at the machine. So you can just use a straight stitch for this if you'd like, and you're going to stitch right on top of your stay stitching again. Okay, I'm doing a zigzag stitch. Um, it doesn't matter. You can do a zigzag or a straight stitch. Okay, if you do a zigzag, don't do a really big, wide, far apart zigzag. Okay, keep it smaller, and this kind of just grabs more of the fabric. And again, I'm doing a dart, but if you're doing a princess seam, you'll do the same thing. Again, pin together your stay stitching and just straight stitch it or zigzag it together. And this will eliminate the bulk. So here you can see it's just a nice flat seam now from both sides, and it's even. And now I have both sides of my canvas for the front of the jacket ready to go.